Are we on the right track towards building a truly disaster resilient community or communities in the Philippines? And my take on this, I might be wrong on this, we might be doing the same things over and over again without really creating much of an impact. Think about it this way, Professor. We go through 20 typhoons a year, and some of these typhoons really create a rare devastating impact on communities, but the way that we respond to them, the way that we rebuild the communities after the storm seems like they go through the same process, and the communities are no better off than when they were initially hit. So it doesn't seem like we're building back better.
Well, I think, when you look at disaster risk management or disaster risk reduction, okay, there are real questions. So if we talk about what happens after a typhoon, and if we try to reimagine the lives of people that were affected by a typhoon, of course, the first question is, how do we make sure that we avoid them getting exposed to some hazard, or to the same hazard, or to different hazards, right? So this becomes a question now of geography, geohazard, and the question is, especially for those that were completely wiped out, is how will they be how will they be planted again into a different or a new community so that they may be their exposure to the risk can be reduced, and they can actually maybe attempt to recover and rebuild their lives and rebuild their savings, etc. So I'm really not, having seen so many of these past events, I'm not 100% sure whether we are all in agreement as to how that should happen. Okay. Are we in agreement?
We don't know what actual resilience means for everybody.
I think, when we try to envision what people's lives should be after a disaster, I don't know whether we all agree on what the moral or socially acceptable ethical thing is. Because, for example, if a farmer wants to go back to the mountain because that's where his family basically they've been there for several generations.
In spite of the fact that that mountain is prone to landslides and whatnot.
Yes, and they insist that they want to stay there. And technically that's within their right to decide that they should stay there. But does the state or does the community or the society have a right also or a say to tell that person that you cannot go back? And, where does the line get drawn? I would assume that, like in the case of Taal, that the immediate island was already declared no man's land. So there's no rebuilding that can happen there. But if you look at everybody who lives around the crater or the lake, within the 14-kilometer radius, I think the question is, should they be able to rebuild? And I guess the consensus is yes, they should be able to rebuild. But then, they're again exposed to perhaps, we don't know exactly when it's going to happen again. We don't know if it's going to be a smaller or a bigger event. We don't know if the risk is going to be higher. We don't know if they're actually rebuilding, taking into account that it's going to happen within the next few years. So, I guess the reality is we can rebuild any way we want to rebuild, or the communities can rebuild any way they want to rebuild. The question, though, is that how do they get influenced to rebuild in a certain way or in a certain place, or to rebuild somewhere else? The thought process behind how to recover and the thought process behind what to construct and what to provide in terms of the rehabilitation, I think that's a kind of conversation that needs to happen. And I think maybe...
I think even the people leading that is also asking themselves...
What should they do?
What should they do? Because that's a very valid point. If they have lived there for all their lives, uprooting them, moving them to a safer place, sounds good for, I think, all intents and purposes. But for the people directly affected, that's going to be a big change.
Yeah, and I think... we live in a democracy, so people have rights. Those properties are titled. They have legal rights to those properties. So on one hand, that's one consideration. Of course, the local governments have responsibility over those pieces of land, so they do also have an influence. They can pass ordinances. They can influence the way redevelopment happens. National government can provide incentives. They can provide direct investments in how the place can be rebuilt. So, if you're talking about trying to reimagine resiliency, and if we're asking ourselves, how is Taal going to, the whole Cavite, Batangas area around Taal volcano, how is that going to be more resilient in the future? The response is one thing. I would actually argue that the response, the service level of the response was quite good because, my mom is from Taal actually, and I know firsthand that regardless of where they were relocated after the eruption, they received relief goods, even if they weren't from the town that they relocated to. So if they relocated to San Juan here in Metro Manila, the San Juan DRRMO office gave the evacuees from Taal relief goods. So, in terms of the relief goods, no problem. But in terms of how livelihoods will be rebuilt, how businesses will be rebuilt, how farms will be rebuilt, how the schools will resume classes, and all of these things, I'm both happy, I'm both optimistic and cautious at the same time. I'm optimistic because there's really a big opportunity to reimagine the way things are rebuilt there to really make life much better than it used to be. Unfortunately, the event happened, so the best case scenario really is to rebuild so that the quality of their lives can be better. But that's really the challenge now, no? Because they're up against time, meaning they have to get back on their feet as quick as possible because they don't have a lot of resources to...
If they prolong getting back to normal, more problems come in.
More problems will come in and, more opportunities will be lost. So there's an urgency to rebuild quickly, but the issue is, do we have processes or mechanisms so that even in a quick rebuild, we're taking advantage of the opportunity to build back better?
That's, I guess, one big question. The challenge of bringing them back on their feet versus bringing them back on their feet in the right and better and safer way.
So normally you might assume that there could be a transition phase where there could be housing provided on a transition basis or livelihood provided on a transition basis, assuming that there is actually a plan to support them into something more permanent in the future. But I think the reality is that it's very difficult to assume that if somebody finances a transition today, that the funding for the next transition will still be around in the future, because we don't know. Some other event might...
Just like what happened.
Some other event might overtake another event, and the focus of many people, organizations, is diverted because there are also real risks involved in the new event. So now, we started off with a volcano in one part of one of our islands. Now we're talking about a potential global pandemic, which has real impact on not just part of the economy, but the whole economy. So, it's really a challenge to maintain that level of focus in ensuring the continuity of the whole disaster management process all the way to reconstruction and rebuilding and building back better. It really requires government to provide the resources and maybe the institutional support to ensure that there's focus.
Would you say that it's also required of government to start stepping up their game in terms of programming resilience in everything that they do? Because you mentioned this in class that disasters before tend to happen one after the other. Now they're becoming more frequent. The intensity is getting stronger, and what happened recently, they're happening simultaneous with the other disasters. So maybe that's a call to get governments like the Philippine government to up their game in terms of resilience.
Yeah, I think, government is just one player, very big player, but they're one player. But the rest of the economy is really there are many other actors inside the economy. So I'll just give you an example of what I would consider to be like a very urgent issue in relation to resilience. Okay, so because of the significant decrease in tourists into the Philippines, so I think the estimate today is like a 40% drop in February of tourist arrivals. The whole chain, the whole tourism industry has been severely impacted. Okay, whether it's the transport, airline, land transport, sea transport, accommodation, food and beverage, entertainment, etc. I think everybody's feeling the sudden drop in business, right? So the question is really, when we talk about resiliency, is how do we minimize the impact to the system? Okay, so obviously there's a need to generate demand in the industry coming from different sources that could support these industries but are not traditional sources of tourism. So if that's the case, for example, tapping into new markets, whether it's increasing more of the domestic travel or tapping into new foreign markets, the question is how agile is the government in developing activities that actually persuade the markets to maybe take your vacation earlier or travel to more local destinations, so that maybe the spend can be allocated just to help the industry and the companies and the employees in those companies wait through the effects of the outbreak. Because the issue really is we also don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
Meaning we don't know whether it's really going to come back to old levels.
And maybe that's also part of the mindset that we should start looking into. We don't have a fix right now for this outbreak, and
there's no playbook, right?
Right.
So the challenge really is people need to try. People need to try new things.